Welcome to another edition of Out and About in Richfield. Well, today's going to be a very interesting show. We've got with us today Barry Fritz. Barry is the Director of Public Safety with City of Richfield. And actually, Barry, you're into your last, 10 days or so on the Richfield department?
Yeah, probably more like 8.
More like 8 days. But what's really important is you're talking about over 36 years with the City of Richfield, and
right.
Wouldn't that make you the longest standing police officer ever in the City of Richfield?
Yes, that's true. Currently, I am the longest serving police officer in the City of Richfield. Probably the next longest was 33 years, so I'm about 3 years more than what the previous long-serving officer was. Started in January 5th, 1976.
And Barry, you kind of made your way through the ranks. You were a police officer on the street, and then you were a sergeant, then you were a lieutenant.
Correct.
Then you were a captain. Is that right?
Yes. I was a patrolman on the street for 5 years, then I was promoted to sergeant for 3 years. And then I was promoted to lieutenant, and I was there for 7 years, and then I was promoted to captain, and was kind of stuck in that position for about 17 years. And then in 2008, I was appointed Director of Public Safety.
So really the only position that you haven't held in police department is a detective.
Correct. I wasn't a detective, but I was a lieutenant in charge of the detective division for quite some time.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been here many years, and obviously you've seen a lot of things throughout your time with the City of Richfield. And what Steve and I also are excited about is the fact that you just have an overall passion, interest, if you will, in the history of the entire Richfield Police Department.
Right.
And you've done, kind of on your own, you've done a lot of culling, if you will, of old photos and stories that date way, way back about the history of the department. And so, and we actually are standing in the police briefing / training room in the new facility, and on the walls, and as you can see behind us, are some old photos that that you have had blown up and obviously framed, and that are featured here in the room, and they're so fascinating. And I know there's a lot of story behind each of these pictures. So we're very interested in hearing about the beginnings of the department, actually, and kind of enlightening our viewers as to how did the Richfield Police Department, how did it all begin?
Well, I'm talking about modern police. Now, Richfield, as a village, has been around since 1908. But the real history of police picks up, what, in the late 30s somewhere? Or?
Correct. In 1937, in December of 1937, the City Council decided to put a referendum on the ballot to see whether or not the residents in the city of Richfield wanted to start their own police department. They did that, and the referendum passed. So in January of 1938, they appointed their first police officers here.
So that begs the question, okay, from 1908, or whenever this became incorporated as a village, till in the 1930s, so what did we have, like sheriffs, marshals, what?
No, they had what they called a constable that was an elected position. And the constable was, there was just one of them for Richfield, and he was the law enforcement officer in the city of Richfield at the time. And there was only one of them, but keep in mind that there was, Richfield at that time were very few homes here, and the population was very small, and there wasn't a lot of crime going on. It was mostly actually farmland that was out here. Mm-hmm. So you'd have a theft from a chicken coop or something like that, and that was about all that they had.
Well, who was the constable back then? Do you know who that would have been?
Well, the constables actually went back to 1858 is when they started.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and there were constables back at that time, and the names escape me, but the one in the modern era starting at the time in 1938 when the police department started was George Brenning. He was a constable, and then he was actually the first police officer hired, and he was appointed chief at that time. And thereafter, for a number of years, the council each year just decided to rehire the police officers. There was nothing like civil service or anything like that. So they would meet at the end of the year, and it would be, should we hire him again? Yeah, let's hire him again. Or they would have a decision Over the years, they put on a few more officers, and the ranks of the police department grew over the years until 1945, when they then started civil service.
Okay, so 1945, after the war is over, they start civil service, and that's, of course, when you see the start of the real explosion of growth in Richfield. Kind of begins after the war, and then you got that great growth in the late 40s, early 50s.
Sure.
So the department must have changed a lot during that time?
It changed a lot in that time. What you had were veterans coming back from the war, and they were building homes in the city of Richfield, and that's when the explosion took place. And at that time, just about all the police officers were former military guys that were then police officers, became police officers. So that continued until 1974, basically. And when I look at the history of Richfield Police Department, it's basically in two phases. The first is the police department, and then you had in 1974 when the public safety concept came about. And that's more or less the modern era. The history that I'm doing is basically dealing just with the older police department up until about 70s, something like that.
Okay. Now, some of these pictures you've got that that we want to kind of talk about, some are really interesting. You've got an officer in an old-time car, looks like about a early 1930s vintage car in one of your pictures. Would that have been the constable?
Well, if you've got down on the end down there, and you might see those later on,
yes.
That would be the constable. That would have been Brenning at that time, and he was given a gun and a badge, and that was
not a police car, though, right?
No, that was a regular car. I think it was his own. I don't know if he got mileage for it or whatever. The interesting thing about the constable concept was that the constable still was an elected official through the 40s. So you had a constable in the city, but you also had the police department. And what usually happened is you had one of the police officers run for the constable position, and they were generally elected. So he was a constable and a policeman at the same time, so you didn't have any kind of separation of powers or jurisdictional issues like that.
But that would have been kind of interesting if you had an elected constable who was a police officer reporting to a police chief.
Correct.
But yet, the authority for the constable came from the electorate, not from the chief. Wouldn't that be right? I mean,
right, yeah.
that must have been an interesting.
Yes, you know, in those days, I'm not sure how those sorts of things played out, but they're probably not as politicized as they are now.
No, I'm sure not.
You know, they had the same job to do. So.
You know, one of the other many interesting pictures, you got a picture of a couple of officers with a canoe or a boat or something like that. And what's the background of that picture?
Well, basically, before 35W went in, Wood Lake was more of a lake than what it is nowadays. And, you know, I imagine every now and then there was something going on out in the water, whether someone would try to swim across the lake or go out there in a canoe and capsize or something. And there was no water patrol at the time. And they had a boat, and they had it on a little trailer, and they'd push it out there and do whatever they had to do. So, yeah, it's a little different era than it is today, for sure.
You also have a picture of a police officer with an older time motorcycle. So we assume we had motorcycle police in early Richfield as well?
Yes, in 1955, the Fred Babcock Post donated a motorcycle to the police department. And that was a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, and a fellow by the name of Bob Carson Brock was the first. He was kind of a motorcycle rider already, and he kind of took it upon himself to start the patrol, and then he trained some of the other officers around, and he's still alive today. So
is that right?
That's kind of interesting, yeah. We had the Harley-Davidsons for a number of years. They actually had a Harley-Davidson in 1976 when I was hired here, and they cracked that up, and then they fixed it up and resold it, and then they bought a Kawasaki motorcycle for a while in the early 70s that I rode around, and then they cracked that up. And we were without a motorcycle for quite a while until we got the most recent ones, basically through a lease program, and then after a while decided to buy our own.
So tell us, we were just asking you a little bit ago just about currently there's just one officer per squad, and we were wondering if that was always the case or if it used to, you know, officers double up, and you kind of said there was sort of a hybrid of that.
Well, years ago, going way back, they would have Well, first off, you'd have maybe just 2 police officers on the department, and they would work 7 days a week, but they would generally double up, mostly because there was only 1 car. And there was, you know, the safety issues, so they would double up. And there was some time at some point, I'm not sure the exact year, but I think it was in the early 50s when I think it was Cy Johnson at the time decided or a council person put forward the idea to have just 1 person in a car for economical reasons, I guess. And that was debated, and the officers didn't like that, but they ended up on a compromise where during the daytime they had just 1 officer, and then at night they doubled up into squad cars. I'm not sure when they went to all single squad cars, but when I started here in '76, they were 1-man squad cars.
It looks like, and I don't know how much time you spent on this aspect of it, but it looks like back in the old days, and I'm talking early 50s, most of the squad cars that I could see in the old pictures were the old Fords, like the old 50 Ford, 51 Ford, you know, those kind of cars, and I imagine they mostly had V8s in them, and so they were a pretty fast car for its time, I would imagine. Yeah,
they were. Fords kind of had the market on the cars for many years, and I have excerpts from councils where they were approved for purchases and things like that. That's kind of in a story timeline in a document, and it's kind of cute to see what they paid for those cars.
Oh, I imagine.
They were pretty cheap at the time, but yes, it's nice that the pictures were preserved, and they weren't preserved intentionally, and I just kind of got interested in them in the sense that I ran across them. You know, from time to time we would be cleaning out our archives downstairs, and the clerical people weren't very comfortable throwing things out on their own, so I would get down there as the command staff and say, yeah, this can go, and that can go. And I found the pictures and decided to keep and save some of them and started to go through them, and there's many more pictures than what we have here, but there's a lot of them that are just of accident scenes and things like that. In the old days, what you had was you had people and photographers that made their money taking pictures related to police activity, and they would show up. They had scanners at the time where they would have radios, and they would show up at crime scenes. And you've all seen the old Graflex, big old large format.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Cameras that were all black and white, and they would take these pictures, and that's where these pictures came from. The police department was also more interested in documenting their activities. They would have yearly lineups, and they would have pictures taken of them, and then they were available to the families, and they were kept by the department also. And then when new officers were hired, they would take these very nice portraits that were in the hallway of the police department. And I have some of those. Most of those I got from family members that had kept them of their dads and brought them in for me to scan into the computer for the history project. But that kind of stopped early 70s, and that when Instamatic cameras came around and the police officers were having them in the squad cars and took their own pictures, and these large format photographers kind of gave that up.
Now, beside all the pictures that you have, are you writing any narrative to go along with this in your project or not?
Well, yeah, it's basically excerpts from council meetings, and civil service meetings, and then just some highlights of some other significant events added to that. And most of that stuff was actually compiled by Sergeant Roger Osberg many years ago, back in 1976.
I remember him.
So I had that, and we digitized it, and I made some additions and some changes to it, and then added some things in there that indicate when the first policewoman was hired and when the first patrol policewoman was out on the street. And
when was that, by the way?
Well, in 1955, they advertised for a policewoman, and Pat Kelly was hired. She'd worked at the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. But at that time, they weren't patrol officers that went out on the street in uniform. They were juvenile officers and school officers and kind of investigators. And then they were grandfathered into the detective positions later on when public safety came together. The first female police officer that started on the road was in 1975, just prior to me coming here. Prior to that, there hadn't been none. So that was kind of the turning point. Right around the middle 70s, you started to see policewomen that were coming into the ranks.
Well, over the years, you think of big events that had happened regarding the police department. Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is the the Fred Babcock incident, and that's where we had one of our police officers shot in the line of duty. That's the only time, right, Barry, in history?
Yes, just one. That was in 1949, June of 1949. Fred Babcock was with Officer Poulter, and they were responding to a call of a possible burglary in progress at 76 in Lindale at the National T there. The people that lived in the street right behind them kind of saw a car that didn't belong there, and some guys walking around the building, and Babcock and Poulter responded, and Babcock dropped Poulter off on the side of the building, and he went around the back and confronted the car, and while he was talking to the getaway driver, if you will, in the car, one of the guys at the corner of the building that was a lookout shot Fred Babcock through the neck with a rifle. He survived World War II as a veteran, came back, and was killed in the line of duty here after only being on for a very short period of time.
You know, one other big event that most people don't remember or maybe don't know about was the country club.
Sure.
Thing. Tell people about that.
The Country Club Market is over on Penn 66, and
what's there? Was that where the Ark Value Village is now?
That's where Ark Value Village happens to be right there.
Okay, that was
then the Country Club
Country
Market.
Club Food Market.
Supermarket. And there were 3 guys that went in to the market while it was in business. It was open for business. It was a robbery, not a burglary at night.
What year was this?
What year was this?
It was in December 1974.
Okay.
So it was cold out. They went in there and basically made all the patrons lay down on the floor that was there and started to take cash from the cash registers and took the manager to the office and tried to get money out of the safe. Well, there happened to be a guy in the back in the store that was working in produce that saw this, and he called the police department. And we had an officer in an unmarked car within a half a block. And he responded to the north end of the building and was positioned there with a shotgun. And when the bad guys came out of the building, he confronted them. There was an exchange of gunfire. He actually fired the shotgun, and a minor wound to one of the victims, but they went back into the store at that point. Highway Patrol was nearby in the area. They set up perimeters, and they basically had about a 7-hour standoff with 30 hostages in the building. It made national news. I actually wasn't a police officer at the time, but I remember seeing it on the national news. And they negotiated, one of the guys came out that was injured, and basically they talked everybody out of there, you know, without any further injuries. But that was what prompted the start of the Richfield SWAT team.
No, SWAT, for people, that's
Special Weapons and Tactics. It's the guys that you see running around with the military type stuff. And it became obvious, SWAT had already been started out in Los Angeles with some of the riots out there in Watson. And it was obvious there are times that there are police situations where there are bad people that have guns that are superior to the revolvers that the officers would typically carry, and there was a need to have more firepower and special tactics for situations like this. And that was the start of that. But it was at the time, and still may be, with the exception of Attica and some of the other prison hostage situations, the largest hostage-taking situations in the United States.
Really?
Well, 30 people. I mean,
I know that's a lot of hostages, but I guess, you know, that's something you don't hear. That event you just don't hear about.
No.
When you have banks and things like that where they're kind of holed up in there and they're hostages, you know, there might be 5, 6, 7 people in there and some clerks, but it was fairly significant, and it was handled very well and very fortunate. The interesting thing was it took quite a while. They had to go through that whole store for a couple of days afterwards because the bad guys had stashed money behind cereal boxes and stuff like that, and were going to send their girlfriends in to get it. They told them where they were when they talked to them from the jailhouse. So that was pretty interesting.
So you could walk in and get your box of cornflakes and perhaps a couple $100 bills with it. Yeah, right. Yeah. Very nice.
Yep.
So what's your intention as far as, as you pointed out, you're retiring very soon, with this project you're working on? You know, kind of what's next?
Well, essentially what I have is I have a number of photos. There's about 50 of them that attempt to show every police officer that worked for the department between, well, when it started in 1938 and to the modern era about, well, the late 60s. In some way or another. Some of them were in group photos where they were in lineups and stuff like that. And it'll be a pictorial video that people will be able to watch. I'm going to put it on disc, and it'll be available to, at no cost to anyone that wants that's interested in it. I solicited input and pictures and information from family members, and a lot of them contributed a lot of the things that I have, and I would give that to them, or my successor would give it to them for nothing. In addition to that, there's many, many, many more pictures that are of more of the modern era. There are old photo ID pictures, and there's motorcycle pictures and squad car pictures, and some pictures of the SWAT team when they were at the FBI Academy. And there's pictures of the Babcock story that has all of the original reports there that are photographed that you could see on screen, and statements from the bad guys. And then that particular incident was reported in 2 crime magazines at the time, True Detective and one other one. I've got pictures of those. And all of those pages are scanned in. So people understand, if you get that video and you play the video, the pictorial video, if you look at that file on that disc, you won't see the individual pictures on there. They're all embedded in one big. So if somebody says, gee, I'd like to be able to get a picture of someone there, then they can go to this other disc that will just have all of these pictures there. They can throw a little kiosk at Walmart or wherever and have blown up pictures made, or just look through them for the fun of it.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Well, you'll have to give a copy, of course, to like the Historical Society.
Well, yeah, basically, I'm going to be gone probably by the time that's distributed, but it'll be here for anyone. I have contact lists of family members that have brought me things that I will get that out to, and the Historical Society would enjoy it, sure. I think the only thing they have now was that short timeline that Roger Osberg did, and very few pictures. But there's a lot of pictures, and it's very interesting. And you know, it's kind of interesting. I was talking. I play golf with a former police officer here, and he knew about the project, and we were having conversations about it. And one of the next times we played golf, he says, "You know, I was thinking about that project that you're having and doing there, and it's kind of a waste of time." And I said, "Well, why is that?" He said, "Well, I was counting up the pensioners' wives that are still alive of any of the guys that would be in those pictures, and there's only about 3 or 4 of them now. You know, everyone else is all dead." And I said, "You know, you just don't get it. You know, this isn't for them necessarily. It's for them, but it's also for the people that are following them, the police officers that come after them. We're all in a brotherhood here. Everyone that's been a police officer in the Richfield Police Department is somehow joined together. And we have a relationship with each other." And that the police officers on my department, when they see these pictures, they're enthralled with them. They're interesting, they just love them. So it's really not for people that lived that and were alive at the time. It's for future generations, and really that's what history is all about and what preserving history is all about. It's for the future, not for the current people.
And beyond that, it's also a physical connection between today and what was, whether it's 1950, 1940, 1930s. So, yes, it's a great benefit that you took the time to put this together, and probably if you hadn't, I can't envision anyone else that would have.
Well, you know, I figured that if I didn't do it, it may not get done.
Yeah, probably true. And
I had an interest in doing it, and I have the ability to use the computer to take advantage of that technology. So it's not going to be anything that's going to be terribly spectacular, but I think it'll be meaningful for people that want to see that. There is nothing at this time that kind of takes its place, so hopefully it'll have some value.
And it's preserved for everybody coming forward.
For sure.
Well, Barry, it's just, of course, that history project is just one of the many things that you've done all these years on behalf of, for the city of Richfield, and obviously we want to take the opportunity to thank you for all your years of service, and obviously we're going to miss you, but we wish you well, and we know you have some good fun plans to look forward to. And
well, I appreciate that. I'm going to miss working here. It's been I mean, I could never imagine myself being in a career that I would have been so happy with, and I feel blessed to have been here. The people that I've worked with have been just wonderful, and the community itself too has always been, everybody, the council and the people in the city here have always supported the city of Richfield Police Department, and it's just been wonderful. I'm going to miss it, but I have other things to do.
Sharpen up those golf clubs, the golf swing.
Yeah, teach the dog to roll over.
Teach the dog to roll over, or the dog will teach you to roll over. I bet on the dog.
Yeah.
Well, Barry, thanks for taking some time to sit with us and talk about the project, and I'm sure that we'll get some inquiries. A couple of things. We have an old show that maybe we should put back on, Pam, about the specific events on the Babcock shooting with another old-time police officer who's another historian, and that would be Floyd Roman. I'm thinking between Floyd Roman and you guys just about have it covered from about 1940 to 2012, don't you?
I think Floyd started in '45.
Yeah.
So yeah, he missed the start of the department by several years. And what's really interesting, Floyd is still alive. He's in many of these pictures.
Yep.
And Bob Carstenbrock is still alive. And it was pretty emotional for Bob. He came and saw himself here, and I gave him a little video tour of what was on there, and it brought back memories
I'm sure.
that he hadn't seen. He's been gone for many, many years now, and he went from here, and he was chief in Winona and then Inver Grove Heights, and it was really quite something for him to see. So I hope it's as meaningful to everyone else as it is to him.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for taking the time to join us on Out and About in Richfield. Until we see you next time, take care.